This audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's The Discovery of India is brought to you by Giribala Joshi. This short YouTube podcast is a part of a larger project. Please subscribe to the channel and like and share the videos. This audiobook is created with the help of advanced text-to-speech AI technology.
Chapter 10, Ahmednagar Fort, again. Part 12, Realism and Geopolitics, World Conquest or World Association, the U.S.A. and the U.S.S.R. The war has entered on its final stage in Europe, and the Nazi power collapses before the advancing armies in the East and West. Paris, that lovely and gracious city, so tied up with freedom's struggle, is itself free again. The problems of peace, more difficult than those of war, rise up to trouble men's minds, and behind them lies the disturbing shadow of the great failure of the years that followed World War I. Never again, it is said. So they said also in 1918. 15 years ago, in 1929, Mr. Winston Churchill said, "It is a tale that is told, from which we may draw the knowledge and comprehension needed for the future." The disproportion between the quarrels of nations and the suffering which fighting out those quarrels involves, the poor and barren prizes which reward sublime endeavor on the battlefield, the fleeting triumph of war, the long, slow, rebuilding, the awful risks so heartily run, the doom missed by a hair's breadth, by the spin of a coin, by the accident of an accident, all this should make the prevention of another great war the main preoccupation of mankind. Mr. Churchill should know, for he has played a leading part in war and peace, led his country with extraordinary courage at a time of distress and peril, and in victory, nursed great ambitions on its behalf. After World War I, British armies occupied the whole of Western Asia from the borders of India across Iran and Iraq and Palestine and Syria right up to Constantinople. Mr. Churchill saw then a vision of a new Middle Eastern empire for Britain, but fate decided otherwise. What dreams does he cherish now for the future? War is a strange alchemist, so wrote a gallant and distinguished colleague of mine, now in prison, and in its hidden chambers are such forces and powers brewed and distilled that they tear down the plans of the victorious and vanquished alike. No peace conference at the end of the last war decided that four mighty empires of Europe and Asia should fall into dust, the Russian, the German, the Austrian, and the Ottoman. Nor was the Russian, the German, the Turkish Revolution decreed by Lloyd George, Clemenceau, or Wilson. What will the leaders of the victorious nations say when they meet together after success in war has crowned their efforts? How is the future taking shape in their minds, and how far do they agree or differ between themselves? What other reactions will there be when the passion of war subsides and people try to return to the scarce remembered ways of peace? What of the underground resistance movements of Europe and the new forces they have released? What will the millions of war-hardened soldiers, returning home much older in mind and experience, say and do? How will they fit into the life which has gone on changing while they were away? What will happen to devastated and martyred Europe, and what to Asia and Africa? What of the overpowering search for freedom of Asia's hundreds of millions, as Mr. Wendell Willkie describes it? What of all this and more? And what, above all, of the strange trick that fate so often plays, upsetting the well-laid schemes of our leaders? As the war has developed and the danger of a possible victory of the fascist powers has receded, there has been a progressive hardening and a greater conservatism in the leaders of the United Nations. The Four Freedoms and the Atlantic Charter, vague as they were and limited in scope, have faded into the background, and the future has been envisaged more and more as a retention of the past. The struggle has taken a purely military shape, of physical force against force, and has ceased to be an attack on the philosophy of the Nazis and fascists. General Franco and petty or prospective authoritarian rulers in Europe have been encouraged. Mr. Churchill still glories in the conception of empire. George Bernard Shaw recently declared that, "There is no power in the world more completely imbued with the idea of its dominance than the British Empire." Even the word empire sticks in Mr. Churchill's throat every time he tries to utter it. Footnote: It is clear that the British ruling classes do not contemplate the ending of the era of imperialism. At the most, they think in terms of modernizing their system of colonial rule. For them, the possession of colonies is necessity of greatness and wealth. The London Economist, representing influential opinion in Britain, wrote on September 16, 1944, "The American prejudice against imperialism, British, French, or Dutch, has led many of the post-war planners to assume that the old sovereignties will not be re-established in Southeast Asia and that some form of international control, or the transfer of the imperium to local peoples, will take the place of the old authority exercised by the Western nations. Since this attitude exists and is even backed by the most widely distributed American journals and newspapers, it is time that the future intentions of the British, the French, and the Dutch were frankly and fully explained. Since none of them has any intention of abandoning its colonial empire, but on the contrary regards the restoration of Malaya to the British, the East Indies to the Dutch, and French Indochina to the French as an essential part of the destruction of Japan's co-prosperity sphere, it would be inviting the worst sort of misunderstanding, and even accusation of bad faith, if the three nations allowed any doubt on the matter to continue in the mind of their American ally. End of footnote. There are many people in England, America and elsewhere, who want the future to be different from the past, and who fear that unless this is so, fresh wars and disasters, on a more colossal scale, will follow this present war. But those who have power and authority do not appear to be much influenced by these considerations, or are themselves in the grip of forces beyond their control. In England, America, and Russia we revert to the old game of power politics on a gigantic scale. That is considered realism in practical politics. An American authority on geopolitics, Professor N.J. Speakman, has written in a recent book, "The statesman who conducts foreign policy can concern himself with the values of justice, fairness, and tolerance only to the extent that they contribute to, or do not interfere with, the power objective. They can be used instrumentally as moral justification for the power quest, but they must be discarded the moment their application brings weakness. The search for power is not made for the achievement of moral values are used to facilitate the attainment of power." Footnote, from America's Strategy and World Politics. End of footnote. This may not be representative of American thought, but it certainly represents a powerful section of it. Mr. Walter Lippmann's vision of the 3 or 4 orbits encompassing the globe, the Atlantic Community, the Russian, the Chinese, and later the Hindu-Muslim in South Asia, is a continuation of power politics on a vaster scale, and it is difficult to understand how he can see any world peace or cooperation emerging out of it. America, the curious mixture of what is considered hard-headed realism and a vague idealism and humanitarianism. Which of these will be the dominating tendency of the future, or what will result from their mixing together? Whatever the mass of the people may think, foreign policy remains a preserve for the experts in charge of it, and they are usually wedded to a continuation of old traditions, and fear any innovations which might involve their countries in new risks. Realism of course there must be, for no nation can base its domestic or foreign policy on mere goodwill and flights of the imagination. But it is a curious realism that sticks to the empty shell of the past, and ignores or refuses to understand the hard facts of the present, which are not only political and economic, but also include the feelings and urges of vast numbers of people. Such realism is more imaginative and divorced from today's and tomorrow's problems than much of the so-called idealism of many people. Geopolitics has now become the anchor of the realist, and its jargon of heartland and rimland is supposed to throw light on the mystery of national growth and decay. Originating in England, or was it Scotland? It became the guiding light of the Nazis, fed their dreams and ambitions of world domination, and led them to disaster. A partial truth is sometimes more dangerous than a falsehood, a truth that has had its day blinds one to the reality of the present. H. J. Mackinder's theory of geopolitics, subsequently developed in Germany, was based on the growth of civilization on the oceanic fringes of the continents, Asia and Europe, which had to be defended from pressure from land invaders from the heartland, which was supposed to be the center of the Eurasian bloc. Control of this heartland meant world domination. But civilization is no longer confined to the oceanic fringes and tends to become universal in its scope and content. The growth of the Americas also does not fit in with the Eurasian heartland dominating the world. And air power has brought a new factor which has upset the balance between sea power and land power. Germany, nursing dreams of world conquest, was obsessed by fears of encirclement. Soviet Russia feared a combination of her enemies. England's national policy has long been based on a balance of power in Europe and opposition to any dominating power there. Always there has been fear of others, and that fear has led to aggression and tortuous intrigues. An entirely new situation will arise after the present war, with two dominating world powers, the U.S.A. and the U.S.S.R. and the rest a good distance behind them, unless they form some kind of bloc. And now even the United States of America are told by Professor Speakman, in his last testament, that they are in danger of encirclement, that they should ally themselves with a rimland nation, that in any event they should not prevent the heartland, which means now the U.S.S.R., from uniting with the rimland. All this looks very clever and realistic, and yet is supremely foolish, for it is based on the old policy of expansion and empire, and the balance of power, which inevitably leads to conflict and war. Since the world happens to be round, every country is encircled by others. To avoid such encirclements by the methods of power politics, there must be alliances and counter-alliances, expansion, and conquest. But, however huge a country's domination or sphere of influence becomes, there is always the danger of encirclement by those who have been left out of it, and who, on their part, fear this abnormal growth of a rival power. The only way to get rid of this danger is by world conquest or by the eliminations of every possible rival. We are witnessing today the failure of the latest attempt at world domination. Will that lesson be learnt, or will there be others, driven by ambition and pride of race and power, to try their fortunes on this fatal field? There really seems no alternative between world conquest and world association. There is no choice of a middle course. The old divisions and the quest of power politics have little meaning today, and do not fit in with our environment, yet they continue. The interests and activities of states overflow their boundaries and are worldwide. No nation can isolate itself or be indifferent to the political or economic fate of other nations. If there is no cooperation, there is bound to be friction with its inevitable results. Cooperation can only be on a basis of equality and mutual welfare, on a pulling up of the backward nations and peoples to a common level of well-being and cultural advancement, on an elimination of racialism and domination. No nation and no people are going to tolerate domination and exploitation by another, even though this is given some more pleasant name. Nor will they remain indifferent to their own poverty and misery when other parts of the world are flourishing. That was only possible when there was ignorance of what was happening elsewhere. All this seems obvious, and yet the long record of past happenings tell us that the mind of man lags far behind the course of events and adjusts itself only slowly to them. Self-interest itself should drive every nation to this wider cooperation in order to escape disaster in the future and build its own free life on the basis of others' freedom. But the self-interest of the realist is far too limited by past myths and dogmas, and regards ideas and social forms, suited to one age, as immutable and as unchanging parts of human nature and society, forgetting that nothing is so changeable as human nature and society. Religious forms and notions take permanent shape, social institutions become petrified, war is looked upon as a biological necessity, empire and expansion as the prerogatives of a dynamic and progressive people, the profit motive as the central fact dominating human relations, and ethnocentrism, a belief in racial superiority, becomes an article of faith, and even when not proclaimed, is taken for granted. Some of these ideas were common to the civilizations of East and West. Many of them form the background of modern Western civilization, out of which fascism and Nazism grew. Ethically, there is no great difference between them and the fascist creed, though the latter went much further in its contempt for human life and all that humanism stands for. Indeed, humanism, which colored the outlook of Europe for so long, is a vanishing tradition there. The seeds of fascism were present in the political and economic structure of the West. Unless there is a break from this past ideology, success in war brings no great change. The old myths and fancies continue, and pursued as of old by the Furies, we go through the self-same cycle again. The two outstanding facts emerging from the war are the growth in power and actual and potential wealth of the U.S.A. and the U.S.S.R. The Soviet Union actually is probably poorer than it was prior to the war, owing to enormous destruction, but its potential is tremendous, and it will rapidly make good and go further ahead. In physical and economic power, there will be none to challenge it on the Eurasian continent. Already it is showing an expansionist tendency, and is extending its territories more or less on the basis of the Tsar's empire. How far this process will go, it is difficult to say. Its socialist economy does not necessarily lead to expansion, for it can be made self-sufficient. But other forces and old suspicions are at play, and again we notice the fear of so-called encirclement. In any event, the U.S.S.R. will be busy for many years in repairing the ravages of war. Yet the tendency to expand, if not in territory then in other ways, is evident. No other country today presents such a politically solid and economically well-balanced picture as the Soviet Union, though some of the developments there in recent years have come as a shock to many of its old admirers. Its present leaders have an unchallengeable position, and everything depends on their outlook for the future. The United States of America have astonished the world by their stupendous production and organizing capacity. They have thus, not only played a leading part in the war, but have accelerated a process inherent in American economy and produced a problem for themselves which will tax their wits and energies to the utmost. Indeed, it is not easy to foresee how they will solve it within the limits of their existing economic structure without serious internal and external friction. It is said that America has ceased to be isolationist. Inevitably so, for she must now depend to an extent on her exports abroad. What was a marginal factor in her pre-war economy, which could almost be ignored, will now be a dominant consideration. Where will all these exports go to, without creating friction and conflict, when production for peace takes the pace of war production? And how will the millions of armed men returning home be absorbed? Every warring country will have to face this problem, but none to the same extent as the U.S.A. The vast technological changes that have taken place will lead to very great overproduction or to mass unemployment, or possibly to both. Unemployment on any major scale will be bitterly resented and has been ruled out by the declared policy of the United States government. Much thought is already being given to the absorption of the returning soldiers, etc., in gainful employment and to the prevention of unemployment. Whatever the domestic aspect of all this may be, and it will be serious enough, unless basic changes take place, the international aspect is equally important. Such is the curious nature of present-day economy in these days of mass production, that the U.S.A., the wealthiest and most powerful country in the world, becomes dependent on other countries absorbing its surplus production. For some years after the war there will be a big demand in Europe, China, and India for machinery as well as manufactured goods. This will be of considerable help to America to dispose of her surplus. But every country will rapidly develop its own capacity to manufacture most of its needs, and exports will tend to be limited to specialized goods not produced elsewhere. The consumption capacity will also be limited by the purchasing power of the masses, and to raise this, fundamental economic changes will be needed. It is conceivable that with the substantial raising of the standard of living all over the world, international trade and exchange of goods will prosper and increase. But that raising itself requires a removal of political and economic fetters on production and distribution in the colonial and backward countries. That inevitably involves big changes with their consequent dislocation and adaptation to new systems. England's economy has been based in the past on a big export business, on investments abroad, on the City of London's financial leadership, and on a vast maritime carrier trade. Before the war, Britain depended on imports for nearly 50% of her food supplies. Probably, this dependence is less now owing to her intensive food-growing campaign. These imports of food as well as raw materials had to be paid for by exports of manufactured goods, investments, shipping, financial services, and what are called invisible exports. Foreign trade, and in particular, a large volume of exports were thus an essential and vital feature of British economy. That economy was maintained by the exercise of monopoly controls in the colonial areas and special arrangements within the empire to maintain some kind of equilibrium. Those monopoly controls and arrangements were much to the disadvantage of the colonies and dependencies, and it is hardly possible to maintain them in these old forms in future. Britain's foreign investments have disappeared and given place to huge debts, and London's financial supremacy has also gone. This means that in the post-war years, Britain will have to depend even more on her export business and her carrier trade. And yet, the possibilities of increasing exports, or even maintaining them at the old level, are strictly limited. Great Britain's imports, less re-exports, in the pre-war years 1936-38 averaged £866 million. They were paid for as follows. Exports, £478 million. Income on foreign investments, £203 million. Shipping services, £105 million. Financial services, £40 million. Deficit, £40 million. Total, £866 million. Instead of the substantial income from foreign investment, there is going to be a heavy burden of external debt, due to borrowings in goods and services, apart from American Lend-Lease, from India, Egypt, Argentine, and other countries. Lord Keynes has estimated that, at the end of the war, these frozen sterling credits will amount to £3 billion. At 5%, this will amount to £150 million per annum. Thus, on a pre-war average basis, Britain may have to face a deficit of considerably over £300 million annually. Unless this is made good by additional income from exports and various services, it will lead to a marked reduction in living standards. This appears to be the governing factor in Britain's post-war policy, and if she is to maintain her present economy, she feels she must retain her colonial empire, with only such minor changes as are unavoidable. Only as the dominant partner of a group of countries, colonial and non-colonial, does she hope to play a leading role, and to balance, politically and economically, the vast resources of the two giant powers, the United States of America and the Soviet Union. Hence the desire to continue her empire, to hold on to what she has got, as well as to extend her sphere of influence over fresh territories, for instance, over Thailand. Hence also the aim of British policy to bring about a closer integration with the Dominions, as well as some of the smaller countries of Western Europe. French and Dutch colonial policy generally support the British view in regard to colonies and dependencies. The Dutch Empire is indeed very much a satellite empire, and it could not continue to exist without the British Empire. It is easy to understand these trends of British policy, based, as they are, on past outlook and standards and formulated by men tied up with that past. Yet, within that past context of a 19th-century economy, the difficulties facing Britain today are very great. In the long run, her position is weak, her economy unsuited to present-day conditions, her economic resources are limited, and her industrial and military strength cannot be maintained at the old level. There is an essential instability in the methods suggested to maintain that old economy, for they lead to unceasing conflict, to lack of security, and to the growth of ill will in the dependencies, which may make the future still more perilous for Britain. The desire of the British, understandable enough, to maintain their living standards on the old level and even to raise them, is thus made dependent upon protected markets for British exports and controlled colonial and other areas for the supply of raw materials and cheap food. This means that British living standards must be kept up even at the cost of keeping down at subsistence level or less hundreds of millions of peoples in Asia and Africa. No one wants to reduce British standards, but it is obvious that the peoples of Asia and Africa are never going to agree to the maintenance of this colonial economy, which keeps them at a subhuman level. The annual purchasing power, pre-war, in Britain is said to have been £97 per capita, in the U.S.A. it was much greater, in India it was less than £6. These vast differences cannot be tolerated, and indeed the diminishing returns of a colonial economy ultimately affect adversely even the dominating power. In the U.S.A., this is vividly realized, and hence their desire to raise the colonial people's purchasing power through industrialization and self-government. Even in Britain there is some realization of the necessity of Indian industrialization, and the Bengal famine made many people think furiously on this subject. But British policy aims at industrial development in India under British control with a privileged position for British industry. The industrialization of India, as of other countries in Asia, is bound to take place, the only question is one of pace. But it is very doubtful if it can be fitted in with any form of colonial economy or foreign control. The British Empire, as it is today, is not of course a geographical unit, nor is it an effective economic or military unit. It is a historical and sentimental unit. Sentiment and old bonds count still, but they are not likely to override, in the long run, other more vital considerations. And even this sentiment applies only to certain areas containing populations racially similar to the people of Britain. It certainly does not apply to India or the rest of the dependent colonial empire, where it is the other way about. It does not even apply to South Africa, so far as the Boers are concerned. In the major dominions, subtle changes are taking place which tend to weaken their traditional links with Britain. Canada, which has grown greatly in industrial stature during the war, is an important power, closely tied up with the U.S.A. She has developed an expanding economy which will, in some respects, come in the way of British industry. Australia and New Zealand, also with expanding economics, are realizing that they are not in the European orbit of Great Britain but in the Asiatic-American orbit of the Pacific, where the United States are likely to play a dominant role. Culturally, both Canada and Australia are progressively drawn towards the U.S.A. The British colonial outlook today does not fit in with American policy and expansionist tendencies. The United States want open markets for their exports and do not look with favor on attempts by other powers to limit or control them. They want rapid industrialization of Asia's millions and higher standards everywhere, not for sentimental reasons, but to dispose of their surplus goods. Friction between American and British export businesses and maritime trade seems to be inevitable. America's desire to establish world air supremacy, for which she has at present abundant resources, is resented in England. America probably favors an independent Thailand, while England would prefer to make it a semi-colony. These opposing approaches based, in each case, on the nature of the respective economy aimed at, run through the whole colonial sphere. The aim of British policy to have a closer integration of the Commonwealth and Empire is understandable in the peculiar circumstances in which Britain is placed today. But against it is the logic of facts and world tendencies, as well as the growth of Dominion nationalism and the disruptive tendencies of the colonial empire. To try to build on old foundations, to continue to think in terms of a vanished age, to dream and talk still of an empire and of monopolies spread out all over the globe, is for Britain an even more unwise and short-sighted policy than it might be for some other nations, for most of the reasons which made her a politically, industrially, and financially dominant nation have disappeared. Nevertheless, Britain has had in the past, and has still, remarkable qualities: courage and the will to pull together, scientific and constructive ability and a capacity for adaptation. These qualities, and others which she possesses, go a long way to make a nation great and enable it to overcome the dangers and perils that confront it. And so she may be able to face her vital and urgent problems by changing over to a different and more balanced economic structure. But it is highly unlikely that she will succeed if she tries to continue, as of old, with an empire tacked onto her and supporting her. Much will inevitably depend on American and Soviet policy, and on the degree of coordination or conflict between the two and Britain. Everybody talks loudly about the necessity for the Big Three to pull together in the interests of world peace and cooperation, yet rifts and differences peep out at every stage, even during the course of the war. Whatever the future may hold, it is clear that the economy of the U.S.A. after the war will be powerfully expansionist and almost explosive in its consequences. Will this lead to some new kind of imperialism? It would be yet another tragedy if it did so, for America has the power and opportunity to set the pace for the future. The future policy of the Soviet Union is yet shrouded in mystery, but there have been some revealing glimpses of it already. It aims at having as many friendly and dependent or semi-dependent countries near its borders as possible. Though working with other powers for the establishment of some world organization, it relies more on building up its own strength on an unassailable basis. So, presumably, do other nations also, insofar as they can. That is not a hopeful prelude to world cooperation. Between the Soviet Union and other countries, there is not the same struggle for export markets as between Britain and the U.S.A. But the differences are deeper, their respective viewpoints further apart, and mutual suspicions have not been allayed even by joint effort in the war. If these differences grow, the U.S.A. and Britain will tend to seek each other's company and support as against the U.S.S.R. group of nations. Where do the hundreds of millions of Asia and Africa come in this picture? They have become increasingly conscious of themselves and their destiny, and at the same time are also world-conscious. Large numbers of them follow world events with interest. For them, inevitably, the test of each move or happening is this: does it help towards our liberation? Does it end the domination of one country over another? Will it enable us to live freely the life of our choice in cooperation with others? Does it bring equality and equal opportunity for nations as well as groups within each nation? Does it hold forth the promise of an early liquidation of poverty and illiteracy and bring better living conditions? They are nationalistic, but this nationalism seeks no dominion over, or interference with, others. They welcome all attempts at world cooperation and the establishment of an international order, but they wonder and suspect if this may not be another device for continuing the old domination. Large parts of Asia and Africa consist of an awakened, discontented, seething humanity, no longer prepared to tolerate existing conditions. Conditions and problems differ greatly in the various countries of Asia, but throughout this vast area, in China and India, in Southeast Asia, in Western Asia, and the Arab world run common threads of sentiment and invisible links, which hold them together. For 1,000 years or more, while Europe was backward and often engulfed in its dark ages, Asia represented the advancing spirit of man. Epoch after epoch of a brilliant culture flourished there and great centers of civilization and power grew up. About 500 years ago Europe revived and slowly spread eastward and westward till, in the course of centuries, it became the dominant continent of the world in power, wealth, and culture. Was there some cycle about this change, and is that process now being reversed? Certainly, power and authority have shifted more to America in the far west and to Eastern Europe, which was organically hardly a part of the European heritage. And in the East also there has been tremendous growth in Siberia, and other countries of the East are ripe for change and rapid advance. Will there be conflict in the future or a new equilibrium between the East and the West? But only the distant future will decide that, and it serves little purpose to look so far ahead. For the present, we have to carry the burden of the day and face the many problems which afflict us. Behind these problems in India, as in many other countries, lies the real issue, which is not merely the establishment of democracy of the 19th century European type, but also a far-reaching social revolution. Democracy has itself become involved in that seemingly inevitable change, and hence among those who disapprove of the latter, doubts and denials arise about the feasibility of democracy, and this leads to fascist tendencies and the continuation of an imperialist outlook. All our present-day problems in India, the communal or minority problem, the Indian princes, vested interests of religious groups and the big landowners, and the entrenched interests of British authority and industry in India, ultimately resolve themselves into opposition to social change. And because any real democracy is likely to lead to such change, therefore democracy itself is objected to and considered as unsuited to the peculiar conditions of India. So the problems of India, for all their seeming variety and differences from others, are of the same essential nature as the problems of China or Spain, or many other countries of Europe and elsewhere, which the war has brought to the surface. Many of the resistance movements of Europe reflect these conflicts. Everywhere the old equilibrium of social forces has been upset, and till a new equilibrium is established there will be tension, trouble, and conflict. From these problems of the moment, we are led to one of the central problems of our time: how to combine democracy with socialism, how to maintain individual freedom and initiative, and yet have centralized social control and planning of the economics of the people, on the national as well as the international plane. End of Part 12, titled, Realism and Geopolitics, World Conquest or World Association, the U.S.A. and the U.S.S.R., of Chapter 10. Part 13, Freedom and Empire. The U.S.A. and the Soviet Union seem destined to play a vital part in the future. They differ from each other almost as much as any two advanced countries can differ, and even their faults lie in opposite directions. All the evils of a purely political democracy are evident in the U.S.A., the evils of the lack of political democracy are present in the U.S.S.R. And yet they have much in common: a dynamic outlook and vast resources, a social fluidity, an absence of a medieval background, a faith in science and its applications, and widespread education and opportunities for the people. In America, in spite of vast differences in income, there are no fixed classes as in most countries, and there is a sense of equality. In Russia, the outstanding event of the past 20 years has been the tremendous educational and cultural achievements of the masses. Thus, in both countries the essential basis for a progressive, democratic society is present, for no such society can be based on the rule of a small intellectual elite over an ignorant and apathetic people. Nor can such an elite long continue to dominate over an educationally and culturally advanced people. 100 years ago, de Tocqueville, discussing the Americans of those days, said, "If the democratic principle does not, on the one hand, induce men to cultivate science for its own sake, on the other, it does enormously increase the number of those who do cultivate it. Permanent inequality of conditions leads men to confine themselves to the arrogant and sterile researches of abstract truths, whilst the social condition and institutions of democracy prepare them to seek the immediate and useful practical results of the sciences. The tendency is natural and inevitable. Since then, America has developed and changed and become an amalgam of many races, but its essential characteristics continue. Yet another common characteristic of both Americans and Russians is that they do not carry that heavy burden of the past which has oppressed Asia and Europe, and conditioned to a great extent their activities and conflicts. They cannot, of course, escape, as none of us can, the terrible burden of this generation. But they have a clearer past, so far as other people are concerned, and are less encumbered for their journey into the future. As a result of this, they can approach other peoples without that background of mutual distrust, which always accompanies the contacts of well-established imperialist nations with others. Not that their past is free of spots and stains and suspicions. Americans have their Negro problem, which is a continuing reproach to their professions of democracy and equality. Russians have yet to wipe out memories of past hatreds in Eastern Europe, and the present war is adding to them. Still, Americans make friends easily in other countries. Russians are almost totally devoid of racialism. Most of the European nations are full of mutual hatreds and past conflicts and injustices. The imperialist powers have inevitably added to this the intense dislike for them of people over whom they have ruled. Because of England's long record of imperialist rule, her burden is the greatest. Because of this, or because of racial characteristics, Englishmen are reserved and exclusive and do not easily make friends with others. They are unfortunately judged abroad by their official representatives, who are seldom the standard-bearers of their liberalism or culture, and who often combine snobbery with an apparent piety. These officials have a peculiar knack of antagonizing others. Some months ago, a secretary to the Government of India wrote an official letter to Mr. Gandhi, in detention, which was an example of studied insolence, and which was looked upon by large numbers of people as a deliberate insult to the Indian people. For Gandhi happens to be a symbol of India. Another era of imperialism, or an age of international cooperation or world commonwealth, which is it going to be in the future? The scales incline towards the former and the old arguments are repeated, but not with the old candor. The moral urges of mankind and its sacrifices are used for base ends, and rulers exploit the goodness and nobility of man for evil purposes and take advantage of the fears, hatreds, and false ambitions of the people. They used to be more frank about empire in the old days. Speaking of the Athenian Empire, Thucydides wrote, "We make no fine profession of having a right to our empire because we overthrew the barbarians single-handed, or because we risked our existence for the sake of our dependence and of civilization." States, like men, cannot be blamed for providing for their proper safety. If we are now here in Sicily, it is in the interest of our own security. It is fear that forces us to cling to our empire in Greece, and it is fear that drives us hither, with the help of our friends, to order matters in Sicily. And again, when he referred to the tribute of the Athenian colonies, it may seem wickedness to have won it, but it is certainly folly to let it go. The history of Athens is full of lessons of the incompatibility of democracy with empire, of the tyranny of a democratic state over its colonies, and the swift deterioration and fall of that empire. No upholder of freedom and empire today could state his case so well and so eloquently as Thucydides did. We are the leaders of civilization, the pioneers of the human race. Our society and intercourse is the highest blessing man can confer. To be within the circle of our influence is not dependence, but a privilege. Not all the wealth of the East can repay the riches we bestow. So we can work on cheerfully, using the means and the money that flow into us, confident that, try as they will, we shall still be creditors. For through effort and suffering, and on many a stricken field, we have found the secret of human power, which is the secret of happiness. Men have guessed at it under many names, but we alone have learnt to know it, and to make it at home in our city. And the name we know it by is freedom, for it has taught us that to serve is to be free. Do you wonder why it is that alone among mankind we confer our benefits, not on conditions of self-interest, but in the fearless confidence of freedom? All this has a familiar ring in these days, when freedom and democracy are so loudly proclaimed and yet limited to some only. There is truth in it and a denial of truth. Thucydides knew little of the rest of mankind, and his vision was confined to the Mediterranean countries. Proud of the freedom of his famous city, praising this freedom as the secret of happiness and human power, yet he did not realize that others also aspired to this freedom. Athens, lover of freedom, sacked and destroyed Melos, and put to death all the grown men there and sold the women and children as slaves. Even while Thucydides was writing of the empire and freedom of Athens, that empire had crumbled away and that freedom was no more. For it is not possible for long to combine freedom with domination and slavery. One overcomes the other, and only a little time divides the pride and glory of empire from its fall. Today, much more than ever before, freedom is indivisible. The splendid eulogy of Pericles for his beloved city was followed soon after by its fall and the occupation of the Acropolis by a Spartan garrison. Yet his words move us still for their love of beauty, wisdom, freedom and courage, not merely in their application to the Athens of his day, but in the larger context of the world. We are lovers of beauty without extravagance, and lovers of wisdom without unmanliness. Wealth to us is not mere material for vainglory but an opportunity for achievement, and poverty we think it no disgrace to acknowledge, but a real degradation to make no effort to overcome. Let us draw strength, not merely from twice-told arguments, how fair and noble a thing it is, to show courage in battle, but from the busy spectacle of our great city's life as we have it before us day by day, falling in love with her as we see her, and remembering that all this greatness she owes to men with the fighter's daring, the wise man's understanding of his duty, and the good man's self-discipline in its performance, to men, who, if they failed in any ordeal, disdained to deprive the city of their services, but sacrificed their lives as the best offerings on her behalf. So they gave their bodies to the Commonwealth and received, each for his own memory, praise that will never die, and with it the grandest of all sepulchres, not that in which their mortal bones are laid, but a home in the minds of men, where their glory remains fresh to stir to speech or action as the occasion comes by. For the whole earth is a sepulchre of famous men, and their story is not graven only on stone over their native earth, but lives on far away, without visible symbol, woven into the stuff of other men's lives. For you now it remains to rival what they have done, and knowing the secret of happiness to be freedom and the secret of freedom a brave heart, not idly to stand aside from the enemy's onset. Footnote: the quotations from Thucydides have been taken from Alfred Zimmern's The Greek Commonwealth, 1924. End of footnote. End of Part 13, titled, Freedom and Empire, of Chapter 10. Part 14, The Problem of Population, Falling Birth Rates and National Decay. 5 years of war have brought about enormous changes and displacements of population on a vaster scale, probably than at any previous epoch of history. Apart from the scores of millions of war casualties, more especially in China, Russia, Poland, and Germany, masses of people have been uprooted from their homes and countries. There have been military requirements, labor demands and enforced evacuations, and swarms of refugees have fled before invading armies. Even before the war, the refugee problem in Europe, due to Nazi policy, had grown to formidable proportions. But these pale into insignificance when compared to war developments. Apart from the direct consequences of the war, the changes in Europe are largely due to a deliberate demographic policy pursued by the Nazis. They have apparently killed off millions of Jews and broken up the population integrity of many countries occupied by them. In the Soviet Union, many millions have moved east, forming new settlements on the other side of the Urals, which are likely to be permanent. In China it is estimated that 50 million people have been torn from their roots. Attempts will, no doubt, be made to repatriate and rehabilitate these people, or such as survive after the war, though the task is one of prodigious complexity. Many will come back to their old homes, many may choose to remain in their new environment. On the other hand, it seems also likely that as a result of political changes in Europe, there will be further displacement and exchange of populations. Of far deeper and more far-reaching significance are the changes, partly physiological and biological, that are rapidly changing the population of the world. The Industrial Revolution and the spread of modern technology resulted in a rapid growth of population in Europe, and more especially in northwestern and central Europe. As this technology has spread eastwards to the Soviet Union, aided by a new economic structure and other factors, there has been an even more spectacular increase in population in these regions. This eastward sweep of technology, accompanied by education, sanitation, and better public health, is continuing and will cover many of the countries of Asia. Some of these countries, like India, far from needing a bigger population, would be better off with fewer people. Meanwhile, in Western Europe a reverse process has set in as regard population, and the problem of a falling birth rate is growing in importance. This tendency appears to be widespread and affects most countries in the world, with some notable exceptions like China, India, Java, and the U.S.S.R. It is most marked in the industrially advanced countries. The population of France ceased to grow many years ago and is now slowly declining. In England, a steady fall in the fertility rate has been noticeable since the 80s of the last century, and it is the lowest now in Europe, except for France. Hitler's and Mussolini's efforts to increase the birth rate in Germany and Italy bore only temporary results. In Northern, Western, and Central Europe the decline is more marked than in Southern and Eastern Europe, exclusive of U.S.S.R., but similar tendencies are observable in all these regions. Europe, apart from Russia, reaches its maximum population, according to present trends, about 1955 and then begins to decline. This has nothing to do with war losses which will aggravate this downward tendency. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, goes on rapidly increasing its population and is likely to reach a figure exceeding 250 million by 1970. This does not include any additions due to territorial changes as a result of the war. This growth of population taken together with technological and other kinds of progress inevitably makes it the dominant power in Europe and Asia. In Asia, much depends on the industrial development of China and India. Their huge populations are a burden and a weakness unless they are properly and productively organized. In Europe, the great colonial powers of the past appear to have definitely passed the stage of expansion and aggression. Their economic and political organization and the skill and ability of their people may still give them an important place in world affairs, but they will progressively cease to count as major powers, unless they function as a group. It does not seem likely that any nation of northwestern and central Europe will challenge the world again. Germany, like her western neighbors, has passed the period in which she could become a dominant world power, owing to the diffusion of technological civilization to peoples that are growing more rapidly. Footnote: Frank W. Notestein in an article in Population and Power in Post-War Europe in the American Foreign Affairs for April, 1944. The ILO have issued a study on the displacement of population in Europe by E.M. Kolischer 1943. End of footnote. Technological and industrial growth have brought power to a number of Western peoples and countries. It is exceedingly unlikely that this source of power will remain the monopoly of a few nations. Hence, the political and economic dominance of Europe over great parts of the world must inevitably decline rapidly, and it will cease to be the nerve center of the Eurasian continent and Africa. Because of this basic reason, the old European powers will think and act more in terms of peace and international cooperation and will avoid war in so far as they can. When aggression is almost certain to lead to disaster, it ceases to attract. But those world powers, that are still dominant, have not the same urge to cooperation with others, unless it is the moral urge, which is very seldom associated with power. What is the cause of this widespread phenomenon of falling birth rates? The increasing use of contraceptives and the desire to have small regulated families may have produced some effect, but it is generally recognized that this has not made any great difference. In Ireland, which is a Catholic country and where contraceptives are presumably little used, a fall in the birth rate started earlier than in other countries. Probably the increasing postponement of marriages in the West is one of the causes. Economic factors may have some influence, but even that is hardly an important consideration. It is well known that as a rule fertility is higher among the poor than among the rich, as it is also higher in rural areas than in urban. A smaller group can maintain higher standards, and the growth of individualism lessens the importance of the group and the race. Professor J.B.S. Haldane tells us that it is a general rule that in a great many civilized societies, those types, which are regarded in the particular society in question as admirable, are less fertile than the general run of the population. Thus those societies would appear to be biologically unstable. Large families are often associated with inferior intelligence. Economic success is also supposed to be the opposite of biological success. Little seems to be known about the basic causes behind the falling birth rate, though many subsidiary ones are suggested. It is possible, however, that certain physiological and biological reasons lie at the back of it, the kind of life industrialized communities lead and the environment in which they live. A deficient diet, alcoholism, neurotic conditions or poor health generally, mental or physical, affect reproduction. And yet disease-ridden and insufficiently fed communities, as in India, still reproduce themselves at a prodigious rate. Perhaps the strain and stress of modern life, the ceaseless competition and worry, lessen fertility. Probably, the divorce from the life-giving soil is an important factor. Even in America, the fertility of farm laborers is considerably more than double that of the professional classes. It would seem that the kind of modern civilization that developed first in the West and spread elsewhere, and especially the metropolitan life that has been its chief feature, produces an unstable society which gradually loses its vitality. Life advances in many fields and yet it loses its grip, it becomes more artificial and slowly ebbs away. More and more stimulants are needed, drugs to enable us to sleep or to perform our other natural functions, foods and drinks that tickle the palate and produce a momentary exhilaration at the cost of weakening the system, and special devices to give us a temporary sensation of pleasure and excitement, and after the stimulation comes the reaction and a sense of emptiness. With all its splendid manifestations and real achievements, we have created a civilization which has something counterfeit about it. We eat ersatz foods produced with the help of ersatz fertilizers, we indulge in ersatz emotions, and our human relations seldom go below the superficial plane. The advertiser is one of the symbols of our age with his continuous and raucous attempts to delude us and dull our powers of perception, and induce us to buy unnecessary and even harmful products. I am not blaming others for this state of affairs. We are all products of this age with the characteristics of our generation, equally entitled to credit or blame. Certainly, I am as much a part of this civilization, that I both appreciate and criticize, as anyone else, and my habits and ways of thought are conditioned by it. What is wrong with modern civilization which produces at the roots these signs of sterility and racial decadence? But this is nothing new, it has happened before and history is full of examples of it. Imperial Rome in its decline was far worse. Is there a cycle governing this inner decay, and can we seek out the causes and eliminate them? Modern industrialism and the capitalist structure of society cannot be the sole causes, for decadence has often occurred without them. It is probable, however, that in their present forms, they do create an environment, a physical and mental climate, which is favorable for the functioning of those causes. If the basic cause is something spiritual, something affecting the mind and spirit of man, it is difficult to grasp, though we may try to understand it or intuitively feel it. But one fact seems to stand out, that a divorce from the soil, from the good earth, is bad for the individual and the race. The earth and the sun are the sources of life, and if we keep away from them for long, life begins to ebb away. Modern industrialized communities have lost touch with the soil and do not experience that joy which nature gives and the rich glow of health which comes from contact with Mother Earth. They talk of nature's beauty and go to seek it in occasional weekends, littering the countryside with the product of their own artificial lives, but they cannot commune with nature or feel part of it. It is something to look at and admire, because they are told to do so, and then return with a sigh of relief to their normal haunts, just as they might try to admire some classic poet or writer, and then, wearied by the attempt, return to their favorite novel or detective story, where no effort of mind is necessary. They are not children of nature, like the old Greeks or Indians, but strangers paying an embarrassing call on a scarce-known distant relative. And so they do not experience that joy in nature's rich life and infinite variety and that feeling of being intensely alive, which came so naturally to our forefathers. Is it surprising then that nature treats them as unwanted stepchildren? We cannot go back to that old pantheistic outlook, and yet perhaps we may still sense the mystery of nature, listen to its song of life and beauty, and draw vitality from it. That song is not sung in the chosen spots only, and we can hear it, if we have the ears for it, almost everywhere. But there are some places where it charms even those who are unprepared for it and comes like the deep notes of a distant and powerful organ. Among these favored spots is Kashmir, where loveliness dwells and an enchantment steals over the senses. Writing about Kashmir, M. Fouché, the French savant, says, "May I go further and say what I believe to be the true reason for this special charm of Kashmir, the charm which everybody seeks, even those who do not try to analyze it? It cannot be only because of its magnificent woods, the pure limpidity of its lakes, the splendor of its snowy mountain tops, or the happy murmur of its myriad brooks sounding in the cool soft air. Nor can it be only the grace or majesty of its ancient buildings, though the ruins of Marchand rise at the prow of their caravas proudly as a Greek temple on a promontory, and the little shrine of Pyar, carved out of 10 stones, has the perfect proportions of the choragic monuments of Lysicrates. One cannot even say that it comes of the combination of art and landscape, for fine buildings in a romantic setting are to be found in many other countries. But what is found in Kashmir alone is the grouping of these two kinds of beauty in the midst of a nature still animated with a mysterious life, which knows how to whisper close to our ears and make the pagan depths of us quiver, which leads us back, consciously or unconsciously, to those past days lamented by the poet, when the world was young, when L'Adèle sur la terre marchait et respirait dans un peuple de Dieu. Footnote, L'art greco-bouddhique du Gandhara. End of footnote. But my purpose is not to praise Kashmir, though my partiality for it occasionally leads me astray, nor to advance an argument in favor of pantheism, though I am pagan enough to believe that a touch of paganism is good for the mind and body. I do think that life cut off completely from the soil will ultimately wither away. Of course, there is seldom such a complete cutting off, and the processes of nature take their time. But it is a weakness of modern civilization that it is progressively going further away from the life-giving elements. The competitive and acquisitive characteristics of modern capitalist society, the enthronement of wealth above everything else, the continuous strain and the lack of security for many, add to the ill health of the mind and produce neurotic states. A saner and more balanced economic structure would lead to an improvement of these conditions. Even so, it will be necessary to have greater and more living contacts with the land and nature. This does not mean a return to the land in the old and limited sense of the word, or to a going back to primitive ways of life. That remedy might well be worse than the disease. It should be possible to organize modern industry in such a way as to keep men and women, as far as possible, in touch with the land, and to raise the cultural level of the rural areas. The village and the city should approach each other in regard to life's amenities, so that in both, there should be full opportunities for bodily and mental development in a full all-rounded life. That this can be done, I have little doubt, provided only that people want to do it. At present, there is no such widespread desire and our energies are diverted, apart from killing each other, in producing ersatz products and ersatz amusements. I have no basic objection to most of these, and some I think are definitely desirable, but they absorb the time that might often be better employed and give a wrong perspective to life. Artificial fertilizers are in great demand today, and I suppose they do good in their own way. But it does seem odd to me that in their enthusiasm for the artificial product, people should forget natural manure and even waste it and throw it away. Only China, as a nation, has had the good sense to make full use of the natural stuff. Some experts say that artificial fertilizers, though producing quick results, weaken the soil by depriving it of some essential ingredients, and thus the land grows progressively more sterile. With the earth, as with our individual lives, there is far too much of burning the candle at both ends. We take her riches from her at a prodigious pace and give little or nothing back. We are proud of our increasing ability to produce almost anything in the chemical laboratory. From the age of steam, we proceeded to that of electricity, and now we are in an age of biotechnics and electronics. The age of social science, which we hope will solve many of the intimate problems that trouble us so much, looms ahead. We are also told that we are on the threshold of the magnesium-aluminium age, and as both these metals are extremely abundant and universally distributed, there can be no lack for anyone. The new chemistry is building a new life for mankind. We seem to be on the verge of increasing enormously the power resources of humanity, and all manner of epoch-making discoveries hover over the near future. All this is very comforting, and yet a doubt creeps into my mind. It is not lack of power that we suffer from, but a misuse of the power we possess or not a proper application of it. Science gives power but remains impersonal, purposeless, and almost unconcerned with our application of the knowledge it puts at our disposal. It may continue its triumphs, and yet, if it ignores nature too much, nature may play a subtle revenge upon it. While life seems to grow in outward stature, it may ebb away inside for lack of something yet undiscovered by science. End of Part 14, titled, The Problem of Population, Falling Birth Rates and National Decay, of Chapter 10. Part 15, The Modern Approach to an Old Problem. The modern mind, that is to say the better type of the modern mind, is practical and pragmatic, ethical and social, altruistic and humanitarian. It is governed by a practical idealism for social betterment. The ideals which move it represent the spirit of the age, the Zeitgeist, the Yugadharma. It has discarded to a large extent the philosophic approach of the ancients, their search for ultimate reality, as well as the devotionalism and mysticism of the medieval period. Humanity is its God and social service its religion. This conception may be incomplete, as the mind of every age has been limited by its environment, and every age has considered some partial truth as the key to all truth. Every generation and every people suffer from the illusion that their way of looking at things is the only right way, or is, at any rate, the nearest approach to it. Every culture has certain values attached to it, limited and conditioned by that culture. The people governed by that culture take these values for granted and attribute a permanent validity to them. So the values of our present-day culture may not be permanent and final, nevertheless they have an essential importance for us, for they represent the thought and spirit of the age we live in. A few seers and geniuses, looking into the future, may have a completer vision of humanity and the universe. They are of the vital stuff out of which all real advance comes. The vast majority of people do not even catch up to the present-day values, though they may talk about them in the jargon of the day, and they live imprisoned in the past. We have therefore to function in line with the highest ideals of the age we live in, though we may add to them or seek to mold them in accordance with our national genius. Those ideals may be classed under two heads, humanism and the scientific spirit. Between these two there has been an apparent conflict, but the great upheaval of thought today, with its questioning of all values, is removing the old boundaries between these two approaches, as well as between the external world of science and the internal world of introspection. There is a growing synthesis between humanism and the scientific spirit, resulting in a kind of scientific humanism. Science also, while holding on to fact, is on the verge of other domains, or at any rate, has ceased to deny them contemptuously. Our five senses and what they can perceive, obviously, do not exhaust the universe. During the past 25 years, there has been a profound change in the scientist's picture of the physical world. Science used to look at nature as something almost apart from man. But now, Sir James Jeans tells us that the essence of science is that man no longer sees nature as something distinct from himself. And then the old question arises which troubled the thinkers of the Upanishads: how can the knower be known? How can the eyes that can see external objects see themselves? And if the external is part and parcel of the internal, what we perceive or conceive is but a projection of our minds, and the universe and nature and the soul and mind and body, the transcendent and the immanent are all essentially one, how then are we, within the limited framework of our minds, to understand this mighty scheme of things objectively? Science has begun to touch these problems, and though they may elude it, still the earnest scientist of today is the prototype of the philosopher and the man of religion of earlier ages. In this materialistic age of ours, says Professor Albert Einstein, the serious scientific workers are the only profoundly religious people. Footnote: 50 years ago, Vivekanand regarded modern science as a manifestation of the real religious spirit, for it sought to understand truth by sincere effort. End of footnote. In all this, there appears to be a firm belief in science and yet an apprehension that purely factual and purposeless science is not enough. Was science, in providing so much of life's furniture, ignoring life's significance? There is an attempt to find a harmony between the world of fact and the world of spirit, for it was becoming increasingly obvious that the overemphasis on the former was crushing the spirit of man. The question that troubled the philosophers of old has come up again in a different form and context: how to reconcile the phenomenal life of the world with the inner spiritual life of the individual. The physicians have discovered that it is not enough to treat the body of the individual or of society as a whole. In recent years, medical men, familiar with the finding of modern psychopathology, have abandoned the antithesis between organic and functional diseases, and lay greater stress on the psychological factor. This is the greatest error in the treatment of sickness, wrote Plato, that there are physicians for the body and physicians for the soul, and yet the two are one and indivisible. Einstein, most eminent among scientists, tells us that the fate of the human race was more than ever dependent on its moral strength today. The way to a joyful and happy state is through renunciation and self-limitation everywhere. He takes us back suddenly from this proud age of science to the old philosophers, from the lust for power and the profit motive to the spirit of renunciation, with which India has been so familiar. Probably most other scientists of today will not agree with him in this, or when he says, "I am absolutely convinced that no wealth in the world can help humanity forward, even in the hands of the most devoted worker in the cause." The example of great and pure characters is the only thing that can produce fine ideas of noble deeds. Money only appeals to selfishness, and always tempts its owners irresistibly to abuse it. In facing this question, that is as old as civilization itself, modern science has many advantages denied to the old philosophers. It possesses stores of accumulated knowledge and a method which has abundantly justified itself. It has mapped and charted many regions which were unknown to the ancients. As it has enlarged man's understanding and control over many things, they have ceased to be mysteries to be exploited by the priests of religion. But it has some disadvantages also. The very abundance of its accumulated knowledge has made it difficult for man to take a synthetic view of the whole, and he loses himself in some part of it, analyzes it, studies it, partly understands it, and fails to see its connection with the whole. The vast forces science has released overwhelm him and carry him forward relentlessly, and often an unwilling victim, to unknown shores. The pace of modern life, the succession of crisis after crisis, comes in the way of a dispassionate search for truth. Wisdom itself is hustled and pushed about and cannot easily discover that calm and detached outlook which is so necessary for true understanding. For still are the ways of wisdom, and her temper trembleth not. Perhaps we are living in one of the great ages of mankind and have to pay the price for that privilege. The great ages have been full of conflict and instability, of an attempt to change over from the old to something new. There is no permanent stability or security or changelessness. If there were, life itself would cease. At the most we can seek a relative stability and a moving equilibrium. Life is a continuous struggle of man against man, of man against his surroundings, a struggle on the physical, intellectual, and moral plane out of which new things take shape and fresh ideas are born. Destruction and construction go side by side, and both aspects of man and nature are ever evident. Life is a principle of growth, not of standing still, a continuous becoming, which does not permit static conditions. Today, in the world of politics and economics, there is a search for power, and yet when power is attained much else of value has gone. Political trickery and intrigue take the place of idealism, and cowardice and selfishness the place of disinterested courage. Form prevails over substance, and power, so eagerly sought after, somehow fails to achieve what it aimed at. For power has its limitations, and force recoils on itself. Neither can control the spirit, though they may harden and coarsen it. You can rob an army of its general, says Confucius, but not the least of men of his will. John Stuart Mill wrote in his autobiography, "I am now convinced that no great improvements in the lot of mankind are possible, until a great change takes place in the fundamental constitution of their modes of thought." And yet that fundamental change in the modes of thought itself comes from a changing environment, and the pain and suffering that accompany life's unceasing struggles. And so, though we may try to change those modes of thought directly, it is even more necessary to change the environment in which they grew and found sustenance. Each depends on and influences the other. There is an endless variety of men's minds. Each one sees the truth in his own way and is often unable to appreciate another's viewpoint. Out of this comes conflict. Out of this interaction also a fuller and more integrated truth emerges. For we have to realize that truth is many-sided and is not the monopoly of any group or nation. So also the way of doing things. There may be different ways for different people in different situations. India and China, as well as other nations, evolved their own ways of life and gave them an enduring foundation. They imagined, and many among them vainly imagine still, that their way is the only way. Today, Europe and America have evolved their own way of life, which is dominant in the world, and which, their people imagine, is the only way. But probably, none of these ways is the one and only desirable way, and each may learn something from the other. Certainly, India and China must learn a great deal, for they had become static, and the West not only represents the spirit of the age, but is dynamic and changing and has the capacity for growth in it, even though this functions through self-destruction and periodical human sacrifice. In India, and perhaps in other countries also, there are alternating tendencies for self-glorification and self-pity. Both are undesirable and ignoble. It is not through sentimentality and emotional approaches that we can understand life, but by a frank and courageous facing of realities. We cannot lose ourselves in aimless and romantic quests unconnected with life's problems, for destiny marches on and does not wait for our leisure. Nor can we concern ourselves with externals only, forgetting the significance of the inner life of man. There has to be a balance, an attempt at harmony between them. The greatest good, wrote Spinoza in the 17th century, is the knowledge of the union which the mind has with the whole of nature. The more the mind knows, the better it understands its forces and the order of nature, the more it understands its forces or strength, the better it will be able to direct itself and lay down rules for itself, and the more it understands the order of nature, the more easily it will be able to liberate itself from useless things. This is the whole method. In our individual lives also, we have to discover a balance between the body and the spirit, and between man as part of nature and man as part of society. For our perfection, says Tagore, we have to be vitally savage and mentally civilized. We should have the gift to be natural with nature and human with human society. Perfection is beyond us, for it means the end, and we are always journeying, trying to approach something that is ever receding. And in each one of us are many different human beings with their inconsistencies and contradictions, each pulling in a different direction. There is the love of life and the disgust with life, the acceptance of all that life involves and the rejection of much of it. It is difficult to harmonize these contrary tendencies, and sometimes one of them is dominant and sometimes another. Oftentimes, says Lao Tzu, oftentimes, one strips oneself of passion in order to see the secret of life. Oftentimes, one regards life with passion in order to see its manifold results. For all our powers of reason and understanding and all our accumulated knowledge and experience, we know little enough about life's secrets, and can only guess at its mysterious processes. But we can always admire its beauty, and through art, exercise the godlike function of creation. Though we may be weak and erring mortals, living a brief and uncertain span of life, yet there is something of the stuff of the immortal gods in us. We must not, therefore, says Aristotle, obey those who urge us, because we are human and mortal, to think human and mortal thoughts. In so far as we may, we should practice immortality, and omit no effort to live in accordance with the best that is in us. End of Part 15, titled, The Modern Approach to an Old Problem, of Chapter 10. This concludes the last chapter of the Discovery of India. An epilogue and a postscript will now follow before we bring this marvelous book to a close.